It seemed like in every one of my math courses, I was 2 weeks behind in my understanding. Coming from that environment, I never dreamed that I would be the lead technical authority of the largest law enforcement agency in the federal government. The person we are today has been forged over a lifetime of experiences.
Welcome to EGR Pod, where engineers tell their stories. Today I'm talking with Steve Moyer, an electrical engineer with over 20 years in the field. He holds a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in electrical engineering and currently works for Customs and Border Protection, where he's been for the past 8 years. Welcome to the podcast, Steve, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Nina.
I would love to hear about where you started out. Why did you choose engineering? Think back to your childhood or whenever the inkling first occurred that you wanted to be an engineer.
This is not a firsthand memory on my own, but this is what I've been told by my parents, was that ever since I was 6 years old, I told everybody that I was going to be an engineer. Now, I am sure when I was 6 years old, that meant of a train, because I grew up very close to Strasburg in Lancaster County, and there were countless field trips and day trips down to see the locomotives. However, as time progressed, I was very good at science, not as good at math.
Really?
Believe it or not, yes. My father recently passed, and I found all of the standardized tests, and I just tested out of the world on the science modules.
But not on math.
Right. I'm above average in math, but no.
Wow, that's probably heartening for some of our students because sometimes they don't feel like absolute math whizzes, though they may be above average.
Well, and, for those students, I spent a lot of time studying math. When I started down into Penn State, was 1987. I was not doing well. I was doing okay, right? I was pulling B's, and, a recruiter got a hold of me. Next thing I know, I'm off in the Navy in the nuclear power program. Nuclear engineering was my first choice. In college, went into the nuclear power program in the Navy, spent 6 years there. Came out. They taught me, actually, when I was in there, to be an electrician.
So this was after Penn State?
After 1 year of Penn State, I dropped out of school. Well, suspended. How about that? And joined the Navy, where they trained me to be an electrician. So 1994, I get out. I come back to Penn State, and I said, well, I'm already an electrician. Electrical engineering seems the lowest hanging fruit to get done in 2 to 3 years, right? Because I had the GI Bill.
Okay. And back at Penn State?
Back at Penn State.
So they were good with you coming back?
They were good with me coming back, accepted all of those credits from the 7 years earlier. So yeah, went back there. My first semester back I took 2 classes, the history of the theater and art history, because I did not want to overtax myself. And what I found was that when I went back there, I had already completed the lower division electrical curriculum in the Navy, right? So that they had already provided me that training. So it allowed me that time to just study math. I was kind of going to the double E courses, but differential equations are not for the faint of heart and never will be.
Right.
And so it allowed me that opportunity to spend extra time getting those math skills back up because I had lost a lot.
You were 6 years older at that point. Do you feel like the wisdom of being a bit older helped you kind of in those math classes in terms of discipline?
I would say it helped overall, right? And I wouldn't specifically point to any single class. One, I had a skill. I had a trait that I could fall back on. I do remember before I joined the Navy, that was my overarching fear, was what if I don't make this? What in the world am I going to do with myself? Going back the second time, I'm already an electrician.
You had something.
I worked in a power plant for 4 years. I had that to fall back on. I felt relief. It took a lot of pressure off. Not that I goofed off or anything, but it just allowed me to relax a little bit and to, really put forth a good effort in a more relaxed manner, which is how I work best.
What an interesting path. So why did you choose to go back and get the bachelor's, knowing that you had the trade? Was it just something you said, I was going to do this and now I'm going to go back and finish it? Or
Yeah, absolutely. Wanted to go back and finish it. I may have still had a little chip on my shoulder that, yes, I said I was going to get this degree. Yeah, I'm going to get it.
And you did.
And I went and I did.
So you were originally nuclear, but then you said, okay, electrical, because I already have all this electronics background. During those years that you were finishing the undergraduate degree, did you ever reconsider something else? Or were you focused and electrical engineering was what you wanted?
I was focused into electrical engineering because as I got into the program, I learned more about it and found out my specialization was actually in the field of optics and optical engineering, which is what I studied for my master's and PhD.
So tell us about how did you get to that master's and PhD? Because it wasn't at Penn State, it was at Georgia Tech. So was there a span of time or was it a direct transfer afterwards?
Oh, it was direct transfer because since I already had a year of college, I had an extra year of GI Bill funding, which expires 10 years after you leave the service, or it used to expire 10 years after you left the service. And I thought, I'm going to burn it up as quickly as I can. And Georgia Tech was offering a 1-year master's program, a paper master's, where you take courses and do the projects during the classes. After a year, you have a master's degree. And I thought, well, isn't that swell? So I had just enough GI Bill to get the master's degree. So I wound up in the PhD program. A good friend of mine was studying to take the, I think it's called the preliminary exam to be a doctoral candidate. Georgia Tech allowed you to have the previous 5 exams and you could work the problems. And then once the administration saw that you had attempted the questions, they would allow you to examine the answer key in the office. It was not allowed outside the office. So I was on academic probation.
As a master's degree student, okay.
Yes. Football season was a challenging time for my academics. So a friend of mine, he was studying for it. He said, you know what? It's an anonymous test. Why don't you sign up? The worst that's going to happen is that you lose 4 hours out of your life.
Fair enough.
I said, okay, fine. So I signed up and promptly told, no, you can't because you're on academic probation. So I thought that was it. Friday before the exam is given, happened to be on campus, and the secretary comes in and says, Steve, wonderful news. You're off academic probation. Here's your code. I'll see you 8 o'clock Monday morning in the auditorium.
Had you prepared?
No. And Nina, I could not have handpicked better questions for me to answer.
That's amazing.
It was a 16-question exam. You had to attempt 8 and pass 6. And between my Navy experience and teaching digital design as a TA at Georgia Tech, that was part of my TA grant. I mean, they were asking me questions I had just taught 2 weeks prior. And obviously the optics section had its 2 questions. I answered both of those. I assume I got them correct. You never really find out
which ones, right?
What happens after this. But yeah, everything is coded. I was given a 4-digit code. The questions are split up between the departments and graded in 2 days.
Was your friend also taking it at this time, or had he?
He did.
Please tell me he also got it.
He did not make it.
That's so devastating.
Yeah, and I just felt so bad because he was putting the time in. He was doing everything you should do. I hope your listeners don't take this as, well, that means I can just blow everything off. And it's fate-driven.
Well, it's an interesting sort of juxtaposition of maybe my grades aren't the best, but I have this knowledge. And so, sometimes students struggle with that they're focused on a grade when really, in reality, it's the knowledge that's going to be of import.
Yes. And, I say that to my children now is that, I don't really care about the grades. What I care about is them learning and getting that knowledge. The logic is that if you have the knowledge, the grades will follow.
Right. But that is not necessarily always the case.
It is not. No, it isn't. I do remember in undergrad, it seemed like in every one of my math courses, I was 2 weeks behind in my understanding. And that, as soon as that exam was over, about a week and a half later, I got and I understood everything that was on that exam.
That's what counts.
In the long run, yes.
In the long run, that's what mattered. Well, I was going to ask you what your most vivid memories or experiences in college were. Those are fairly vivid and memorable. Are there other things, maybe other academic or non-academic or anything else that really just football stands out?
Well, there was the Georgia Tech UVA game where I believe Georgia Tech, we were down 35-0 or 35-3 at the half and then came back to win the game.
It's memorable.
We ripped down the goalposts.
Physically?
Yes, we charged the field. And
was it a home game?
It was.
That's good because it had been somebody else's goalposts. So did you ever return to the Navy after that?
I did not.
No. Okay.
No. There was a time I was considering going back in as an officer in undergrad. Money was getting tight, and the ROTC scholarship would have really helped out, but toughed it out through those times, living on the GI Bill, and
Sure.
made it through. I believe that was one of the government shutdowns that occurred. I was also working at Penn State on a research project that was funded by the Department of the Navy.
After your PhD at Georgia Tech?
No. This
while
is
you were at
while I was
Penn
a
State.
student
Okay.
at Penn State.
Okay.
Again, because of my Navy background in electrical power, one of the mining professors up there had won a grant, and he brought me on to run his lab.
So this was in the mining department?
Yes.
As an electrical engineer, though?
Yes.
So maybe you can talk a little bit to the breadth of what electrical engineers might do and what particularly you did, because it seems like as you progressed through your career, you played many different roles. Is that fair to say, or did you?
Yeah, that is very fair to say. In the beginning, when I went back to college, most of my electrical engineering discipline or education was done in power generation and power usage. Because I was on active warships in the Navy, that's what we did, right? We took the steam that the mechanics made and we converted that into electricity, and then we used that to power the entire vessel. So coming back to college, I thought, well, I've done that. Do I really want to pursue that? And Penn State's program in power generation had fallen into disrepair in the EE department. It was much more computer-focused, materials-focused, such as IC chips, development and building, growing them. And then I found the optics discipline. I thought, well, isn't this cool? So I went through and, as I learned more and more, I thought, well, this just keeps getting better and better, right? Fourier transforms, some technique that I'm sure you're familiar with. Well, in the optics realm, you can actually do a Fourier transform with a lens. And I just thought that was the neatest thing since sliced bread. And it kindled that passion there, which carried me through my master's and PhD.
All in optics?
Yes, and in optical engineering. Then in 2000, I was looking to leave the PhD program. My advisor said, well, I know this guy up in the Army at Fort Belvoir. Why don't you go talk to him, see if he needs a co-op student? And I came up here.
Now, this is before finishing the PhD.
Before finishing the PhD, I had all my coursework done.
Okay.
And so I came up here, worked for the Army at Fort Belvoir as a co-op student, and did my PhD research.
Okay, so you were still in the PhD program.
Yes.
Just doing your research.
And then 6 years later, a few published papers, and they declared that I was done.
So not even being sure after 1 year of bachelor's, you went all the way through into the PhD.
Yeah, by accident. I didn't intend to.
Well, I have a question I normally ask if you thought your path was predictable, but I think that question has been answered.
Yes, no, mine is much more like the random walk.
So you're now at Fort Belvoir, finished the PhD, still doing research there, and you stayed?
I did stay on until 2015. It was a really good place. It's one of the few government labs that government employees still do research at. And so it was really interesting. And I actually got more into the human factors side of research rather than the straight up mathematical. I was in the modeling and simulation division at the US Army Night Vision Lab. And so that division produced a camera model that was calibrated to observer responses. And so I said, well, isn't that neat? And so I started getting more into the human factors side of the research, the construct of these experiments, and how do we faithfully represent the human in this mathematical model.
So at this point, apart from the actual application, what you were doing had very little to do with electrical engineering per se.
Correct. And now I'm branching into psychology applications.
So how does that work? I know you can't tell us too much, but how does that work in the field that you're in, that one can make such seemingly radical transitions to fields that are not necessarily engineering even, in a sense? Or maybe I'm misrepresenting. Tell us a little bit more what you are able to tell us about those sorts of human factors and the psychology part.
Because of the goal of the modeling that we were doing, right? It was literally when a photon leaves a tank and travels through the atmosphere and goes into a camera and then comes up on a video display through until the point says, I know that tank is ... that was the goal of the modeling. And so everything up until the human is physically derivable, and was. It was a first principles model, starting from the Poisson distribution of photons leaving a rough surface up until the photons entered the human eye. Well, actually, up until the point that the signal hit the back of your head, in the brain, right? Because we did model photons into the eye, and we modeled the pupil response, and that your pupil size changes if you're using one eye or two eyes. All of that was physically known already. And so what was provided me was, in this vast model of 144 inputs, I had a single number to represent the decision of a human. And so I looked at it and I said, well, challenge accepted. Yeah. And so I kind of left the physics-driven domain of what most engineers would be in, and said, yeah, I think I can come up with some conglomeration of statistics to faithfully represent the human response to this stimulus.
And were you able, if I may ask?
I think I did. I think I did it quite well. That was most of my tenure in the Army, was doing those type experiments. And that started with, okay, what do we need to identify? What do we need to classify? You remember 2001 were the attacks on September 11th. That started something called the Global War on Terrorism. All of a sudden, all of these camera models had to be recalibrated from tanks in the field to the urban environment. Me and my team did all of that research. We took it and we expanded the portfolio for the cameras to be measured or predicted their performance in the urban terrain, going against people holding rifles and not tanks, people holding hand grenades, people dressed different ways. And we calibrated that model to be able to faithfully compete and predict the performance of cameras against those different tasks.
And so the person who is receiving that data, the person who you're now studying, how they're going to react to it, is there that vast of a difference in, if the image looks accurate and you have 10 people who see the image, are the reactions of those 10 people so vastly different that there's...
Usually not. We didn't use everybody in the world. So we would bring in soldiers. And typically these were 18 through 24-year-old soldiers. By the time we were doing this research, many of them had combat experience, and they came in, they said, no, and they actually became good partners and offered us suggestions about how to improve the reality of these tests. The model that we're using here, the one thing that the model put out is a probability of task completion versus range. And that is where the competition lay in the Army purchasing cameras and camera systems. So we would degrade the images and say, okay, can you see it now? Degrade some more. Can you see it now?
I see.
And all of that, right? So we could map performance versus degradation. And then that degradation, we said, well, the degradation we did here is the same as doing it in distance. And that has held up, actually, fairly well over the years of scrutiny.
So you're at Customs and Border Protection now. Tell us a little bit about that.
I'm a system engineer now.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So back to some engineering.
Yes.
Well, I guess it's all engineering in a sense.
It is. In 2015, I transitioned to Customs and Border Protection as a modeling simulation subject matter expert.
So the common thread is this modeling and simulation.
Yeah, and which in EE, there's a lot of modeling and simulation. So I get over there as a subject matter expert in modeling simulation. CBP at the time said modeling takes too long, it's too expensive, and not trustworthy. So I walked into a very nurturing environment.
Yet they hired someone for it.
They did. They hired me, and I had one contractor support for a 66,000 person agency.
Oh my goodness. And?
Well, we did what we could. We got it started. We built a community of practice. We had monthly meetings, shared what we were doing, in this realm of modeling simulation. Found out that there was about 35 practitioners scattered throughout the agency. Started pulling them together, and about that time is when I left.
Okay.
And I became the deputy chief engineer. And then the chief engineer of CBP, which is the position I currently hold, is the system engineer for the agency. And so I represent CBP in technical matters.
So this is the day-to-day, mostly meetings, communications. What does it look like?
Yeah, it's a lot of meetings. I am charged with the technical assessment of all acquisition programs, all non-IT acquisition programs. Obviously, our chief information officer takes all the IT ones. And with the development of embedded microprocessors, we are now considering almost everything to be mixed. And so me and the CIO stand shoulder to shoulder when these programs come through and say, yeah, no, you got to do your due diligence, right? You got to make sure that you have operational requirements. You got to make sure that you do your functional decomposition down to functional requirements, because that's the system of system engineering, is making sure that you lower your risk of development so that you can get better performing products, hopefully at a cheaper price.
It's kind of seeing the big picture there too.
Yeah. And actually, interestingly, I was not thought of as being able to carry this position because of my PhD. And that people assumed that I would be too narrowly focused on cameras and optical systems and stuff like that. I have heard time and again that I have surprised lots and lots of people.
More versatile than they expected.
Apparently.
That's good. That's great.
Oh, thank you.
What a path. It's amazing. And I guess you did attribute that feeling of the confidence you had knowing you had a trade behind you. But that versatility, perhaps that was something more innate. Did you ever reflect on that to think, some people do get a PhD and they're very hyper-focused on one type of thing and they're not very adaptable. Not everyone, obviously. But you were. Was there something that you look back on that says, yeah, that's how I always was?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to even the standardized exams, right? I'm testing very high in the concept of science, and all of that just seemed innate, right? The workings of the universe. Now, to actually calculate something and tell you that, yes, verily, you need to lower the temperature by this amount to make ice, that was a little sketchy, but being able to put the concepts together, generalize the concepts, right? Undergraduate, I have a minor in physics, and it turns out that gravity and electrostatics are pretty much the same thing. The form of the equations are almost identical, and I think that's actually where I'm best, is that I can look at things and abstract it and say, well, that's just like this other thing over here that I do know about, and so I can take my knowledge of oscillators in AC circuits and apply it to your mass and spring problem because the form is identical.
I guess it comes through curiosity first and having learned some things before you can make the connections.
Yeah. And, and that's the thing, be curious, be reading. I read all the time.
Technical reading. All kinds of reading.
Oh, yes.
No, technical.
Technical. The book I just finished was Systems Thinking from, I think it was 2001. I will sit down and read an algebra book.
Now?
Yes.
For fun?
Yes. I'm losing my office. We're moving buildings. We're losing our lease. So where we're going is a more hoteling type environment. So I brought all my library from the office home. And I thought, oh, well, here's my old calculus book from undergrad. Let's crack that open. I'm halfway through chapter 2 and I am kicking butt.
Good for you.
I am doing the problems. I'm checking them in the back.
Enough books to last you through retirement, hopefully.
Well, and that's the thing. I don't know what my retirement's going to bring, right? I'm 29 years in the civil service. I'm eligible for retirement in a couple of years. And do I take retirement and go do something else? I have a never-ending list of things I would like to do.
That's fantastic.
And I think that is really what has helped guide me, is that it's being curious. Like you said, looking at something and saying, how does that work?
Well, you've said several times, wow, that's really neat, or wow, that's really cool.
Yeah, and just being open to those experiences, I think, it is really what a good engineer is, I believe.
Are there things you would have done differently, knowing how the trajectory went? Looking back, of course, you can't know how if you tweak something, how it would affect the outcome. But are there things that stand out to say, oh, I would have absolutely, this was a misstep. Next time I would have done it differently?
No, I honest to God, I look at that and say, if I had done anything differently, I may not be here today. Growing up, I grew up in rural Lancaster County of Pennsylvania. My dad was a butcher. worked grocery stores and actually some of the butcher shops up in that area. My mom drove school bus. I believe my dad went to the 9th grade, and my mother dropped out of school in the 8th grade.
So you were a first-generation college student.
Yes. My 3 brothers, none of them went to college. Coming from that environment, I never dreamed that I would be here as the lead technical authority of a 66,000 member federal agency, which is the largest law enforcement agency in the federal government. Life, the person we are today has been forged over a lifetime of experiences. And yeah, did I enjoy the Navy? No, I did not. I did not like going to sea. And I spent almost 4 years on the seagoing vessel. But without that experience, I do not come back and say, you know what? School is great. I get to walk outside and see the sky every day.
It's all perspective.
It is. And that is what life teaches you.
Anything you'd like to leave our listeners with? Our listeners are predominantly first-year engineering students, but they could be anyone out there who's listening to this podcast. Anything you'd like to leave them with?
Yes. Don't ever give up. If you fail that test, that's fine. Put it in perspective. And you may not have that as a freshman in college, but this is an experience, right? Failing that test is an experience. Reevaluate, look at it. If that is the path you choose, understand that you're going to have to work harder to get passing grades. And that's fine. Nothing in life comes for free. There's going to be work involved no matter which way you go.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Steve. It's been really enlightening and fun to chat with you. I didn't know so much about these things that you've experienced, so I appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Nina.
And thank you to our listeners. This podcast is produced by Nina Lord and supported by Northern Virginia Community College. For information about engineering at NOVA, please visit us at nvcc.edu or on Instagram at EGR_AT_NOVA.